And, well, it's my pleasure to tell you a story of December 1945. If you remember, that was the time that the Germans slipped through the Ardennes forests in Belgium and surprised the Americans, and that started the Battle of the Bulge. And this incident I want to tell you about was something that happened to me during the Battle of the Bulge. I was dug in a foxhole. It was about as long as this couch that you're sitting on, and it was about this deep and about this wide. And I had a roll of blankets that were held together with telephone wires, and in the middle of it was a down, I called it my down comforter, but it was a down-filled bedroll. And I would unroll this bedroll and put it in the bottom of this foxhole, and the top of it had a number of logs about this thick on the top of it, and those had hemlock boughs on the top of them, and then there was, well, underneath all that was a shelter half, and then the logs, and then the hemlock boughs, and then dirt on top of that. But I could pull the shelter half up at the end and slip myself in the foxhole, and I was closed out of the weather completely, and I was warm at night. My feet were still cold, just as they are frequently now, but even then I was comfortable.
That is wonderful.
And we stayed in this position, the Americans, on the side of a ridge looking across a ravine that had a creek running through it, and a little town, Malmedy, the outskirts of the town of Malmedy in Belgium. And it had been the site of a battle and a skirmish, and up on the other ridge across the way was a brick house, and we could see the brick house, and it was being bombed constantly.
Wow.
And we knew something was going on over there, and we knew there were people in the house, and we knew there had been Germans in this house. Well, one day I was out of the foxhole and circulating with other people, and we were talking, and a man approached me and he said, "Captain Conrad would like to see you at battalion headquarters." Well, Captain Conrad was the intelligence officer for our battalion. So I went with him to battalion headquarters. Captain Conrad was from a little town called Conrad, Montana, and I hope he's still living. He's perhaps too old to be living, but a few years ago he was. I called him to talk to him, and he remembered, and I remembered, and we had just a delightful visit. But in the course of this conversation, he wanted to know if I would volunteer to go down this ravine and up on the other side and go into this brick house and ask them when the last Germans were there, and in what numbers were they there, and in what direction did they go, and did he hear any other information that he thought we needed to know. Well, of course, you know, when the Army asks you to volunteer, that is really just doesn't give you any choice. So I sat and listened, and he said, "We'll give you a white cloak, we'll give you white leggings, we will give you a white helmet, we will give you a white carbine, and every eye on the hill will be on you, because we will stop the firing. We'll stop it, and it will be silenced for 3.5 hours, and you will have an advance guard and a rear guard. There will be the 3 of you up there going over to this house. Be sure you take all of your identification off you and put it in your foxhole or wherever you want to, but be sure you don't have anything on you to identify you." That was all right too. So I got myself the items that he was going to give me and got dressed, and told my friends what I was doing, and about 1 o'clock I was ready to go, and I had taken all of my identification away and put it in my foxhole and pulled the cover up over it and left it. And I went out to the edge of the area where we were camping, and it was very close to a railroad track that ran over a trestle. Well, the snow had fallen for days, and it was hip deep in every direction. That's why we were dressed in white, so you couldn't see us. And it was so deep to step in that frequently you stepped in a bomb crater, and you would go up to your waist in the snow and, of course, pull yourself up and go on. And I had to get across the trestle, and that was one of the most treacherous things I thought I had ever done. In my mind, I was thinking about snow on the railroad bridge that crosses the Tennessee River up at Loudon, Tennessee, and I know how that looks, and I remember it well. But when you have snow this deep on these railroad ties and you want to cross, you can't always tell whether you're going to fall down between them or not.
An illusion.
So it was very treacherous to cross, but I did get across. And then I scooted on down the bank, the embankment which the railroad made, and went on down into the village, and I was to look to see what vehicles were there and by whom they were driven, and there were these frozen American soldiers and frozen German soldiers, just stiffs, in these tanks and in these jeeps and in these command cars. Some of them were American vehicles that had been captured. Some of them were fake vehicles the Germans had painted with American insignia on them.
Wow.
Still, they were all human beings who were dead, and it was a very gross scene, and it was sad, and it made a picture in my mind, and I certainly could go back and report it. But we started on up the hill, and going up the hill was about as treacherous as it had been trying to cross the railroad trestle, because we would all step in these bomb craters and sink down in the snow, pull ourselves back out, and go ahead. And we got to the house on top of the hill, and you could hear the cows bleeding down in the barn. And they were bleeding because of the pain that they had from not having been milked for days. And the chickens were running around. And I knocked at the front door. Well, this Belgian man came to the door, and I explained to him immediately who I was and who these other two men were and what I was there for. And the first thing he did was throw his arms around my neck and hug me and tell me how glad he was to see me. And did I have time to have a drink of cognac with
I hope you
eggs?
did have time.
Well, I told him I didn't. I lied, I think.
Did you speak English?
But I really should back up and tell you the reason they had asked me to go on this trip. There were only 2 of us in our whole battalion who spoke French. And my personality was a much more pleasant personality than the other man, even though he was a good friend of mine. And I had traveled with the officers to go look at houses in Belgium, houses that we could billet American soldiers in, and had met other Belgians because of this, whom I enjoyed during the war years, and even kept up with as long as they were alive, and visited some of them after the war. And it was wonderful to know them and to see them and to talk with them again. But while I was up there, he said, "Do we have time to go down and milk the cows? Do we have time to gather the eggs?" and this sort of thing. And I said, "Yes, I think you have about an hour before the bombing would begin again." So we had a brief visit, and he told me that there had been 16 soldiers, and they hadn't been there for a week. Told me which direction they had gone, and it was no large group. but we at least had an idea, and they were obviously not coming back. So we went outside and turned around and walked back down the hill and tried to avoid these holes, and really tried to follow our tracks because we knew then which direction we were going. And we got down to the foot of the hill and naturally stopped again to look at the vehicles to see what was there and what had happened to them. And everything was just as we left it, and you couldn't imagine in that, it seemed like zero weather, but in that dreadfully cold weather with snow everywhere, and as cold as it was, just to see those stiff bodies sitting there almost looking lifelike, but with no motion at all. But we ascended the bank on the railroad track and had no problem crossing the trestle again, and I went on back to my foxhole, took my white clothes off, got my identification out of the foxhole, and put my own clothes back home, and I was very thankful to be there again. Just as I am thankful to be here.
Great story.
I want to tell you one more story that sometimes upsets me.